It's so interesting this film has like controversial takes now, like between the people that love it and people that hate it. I think it's very clear to see that people like it when horror films do things differently, but it seems to me that if they do things too differently, people start getting a little bit uncomfortable, it sounds like.
Maybe I'm calling you out, huh?
Animals don't get too hung up on reason. They just keep killing.
And today we have In a Violent Nature. From the word go, I was very, very interested in this particular film. I saw the trailer dropped and the premise for it is literally think about it like a Friday the 13th movie, really any cabin in the woods slasher film, but I think we're looking at like a kind of Jason Voorhees situation here, but literally take that film, but from the perspective of the killer himself. Or itself, rather. Now, we've had horror films that have done kind of similar concepts, whether from the point of view of a villain or a killer in general, or just like different takes on it. But the way that it's done in this film, at least as far as you can tell from the trailers, and yes, an overall execution, I don't think we've seen a film like this ever? Question mark. I mean, you know what's good if he breaks out the Shining shirt. It's directed by a Chris Nash, who, though this is his directorial debut for a feature film anyways, when I reviewed Stop Motion, when that came out, the director of Stop Motion had done a short film on ABCs of Death, which is a horror anthology series. Same thing with this. And a kind of similar vein to what this movie is in terms of effects and the practical works he did. In ABCs of Death 2, the very last one, Z is for Zygote, so he's directed some short-form horror media in the past, and now here he is to give us a full-fledged film. But also, fun fact, has experience in film and especially horror and all this. He helped do the special effects on The Void, which if you haven't seen The Void, oh my god, really good. If you love cosmic sci-fi body horror, very good film, very enjoyable. He did the FX for that, which looked fantastic in the movie. I don't know if he was the writer, but I did see he had writing credits for Psycho Goreman, which I have not watched it to this day. I know of Hunky Boys.
Petty displays of wealth. How can your short lifespans allow such narcissism?
Yeah, but look at all the hunky boys.
I do not care for hunky boys.
For the most part, aside from the work done with our main killer, with his heavy layers of prosthetics and just his general movement and mannerisms, of which there's a whole lot of walking and hesitancy and then extreme violence. There's the other, like, who would be the main characters of this movie, but they're kind of, at this point, they almost kind of are in the background of things going on until they show up to be brutally executed. So I'm not going to get too much in the cast right now, admittedly. We're going to go with the pros first. I love this concept. I think I already mentioned that at the start of this review. I wouldn't call it slow burn either. People hated that there was so much like walking around in this film and that it was all from the perspective of the killer. It turned a lot of people off, funny enough. Other people heralded it as like a horror masterpiece. I wouldn't say masterpiece, but I think it's very, very, very good. We've had so many very typical horror slasher films, cabin in the woods, something happens, you go to Camp Crystal Lake, you wake up this evil deity, then it goes off and then it starts showing up and killing your friends off left and right. But instead, those characters are doing their thing in the background to this being that awakens from his undead eternal slumber and then just has one instinct. I need to find my necklace or what have you, and it's just gonna walk around and then, you know, I heard someone talking over here, just on a quest, on a search. And anybody that stands in its way, I guess his way, they identified him as a he in the lore, anybody that stands in his way, even incidentally, is gonna get just eviscerated. It's going to be removed from the equation as this being lumbers on. The concept's great. I love it. I think one of my favorite aspects of this film is that as this guy is walking around and then comes across these kids, the dialogue you hear from the main characters is like you're hearing what the actual ongoing slasher movie plot.
Johnny fell from the tower. His neck snapped as soon as it hit the ground. And And the man freaked out, so they put one of the firefighter masks on him to make it look like he was playing up there by himself and tripped and fell.
They're talking about the lore and the urban legends around the campfire. As the kills start happening, they're like, oh my god, we found so-and-so here. What is this thing? What does it want? Oh my god, there it is.
You don't know what you just did. It's the only thing holding his soul at rest.
Well, give it back.
You can't. He's awake now.
Even though you're only getting snippets of what could be overheard from the killer's perspective and point of view, you can very easily piece together the conventional narrative that would be ongoing in this horror film that we're just kind of like walking through from the killer's perspective. So I love the fact that there is technically story in the background, but our foreground here is what the killer would be kind of like. The killer doesn't care. The killer doesn't give a shit about these kids or what he's hearing. He's on a one-track mission, and then they just so happen to be piecing together the lore of the story as he shows up and then just starts like bonking them. And I think the biggest thing for me, I get on my soapbox about this a lot. Horror films in general don't have to have grotesque, brutal kills, but when you give me like a slasher movie or a movie where there's a killer or whatever, I'm so tired of seeing the same generic like throat slit, neck snaps, just a quick stab, a bleed out, whatever. I'm craving to be impressed. I want to see creativity. I want to see brutal violence. If that's what your film is, the foundation of it's based on. I don't love the Saw movies. I really am not a huge fan of like gore porn for the sake of it, if you know what I mean, especially in the later installments, but I will give them credit. When it comes to how they torture and kill these people, they're always looking up the ante, and the traps are very brutal and creative. I give them props for that and that alone, aside from the soap operas they become. So yes, when I have a horror slasher film, I want to see creative kills, and this film, please do not take these words lightly, especially if you've seen any of my previous reviews on horror movies in the past. In a Violent Nature has some of the most creative and brutal kills I've seen in a movie in a hot minute. I heard people walked out of this movie in some places, not because it was bad, just because it was just too much. It's appropriate for this movie, and what this is a behemoth, a brute, that is tearing these people apart as he moves on through. And it never feels like too much. Some of these kills are pretty simple and even low-key a little bit off-screen, but like 90% of the kills are on-screen, brutal. The effects look great, by the way. The practical effects, amazing work. Between rocks and also yoga. You'll never be looking at yoga the same way again after this movie. That poor woman. A+ on the brutality and the creative, brutal kills in this movie. And I'm happy people are still trying. Simple and often artistic direction. Yeah, most of this movie is staying on our big behemoth of a killer here, and just, whether he's just walking around or rolling up on somebody and killing them, it's not always behind his back. Sometimes it's from looking at him from a distance or from outside of a structure that he's walking around in. But without spoiling the movie, I like how the ending, based on the track record of the movie leading up to it, evokes a sense of dread in us, like evokes the sense of PTSD that we've learned to hold on to and be wary of throughout the entire film. And then for the ending to literally trigger that PTSD that it just gave me over the last hour is so impressive. Like, to make me feel that knot in my stomach, that pit in my stomach. I haven't felt that way, I don't think, since I watched It Follows. Well, I take it back, but that one is a very notable film that on the first watch I had a sense of dread, and oh man, shit, is it gonna go down? I only have like 3 negative notes. One of them I think I could genuinely hold against the movie, maybe 2 of them, but for the most part, 2 out of 3 of them are personal preference. Selfishly, I wanted even more kills. I would have loved there to be more violence, more people dying in these creative, brutal ways, but that being said, there wasn't a shortage of creative kills, and I'm not upset about it. But selfishly, I wanted more of that because what I was getting was already so good. So I think what a lot of people's issues was with the movie, and I only put this here as a note because it only mildly affected my experience. I didn't really care about it too much, but I suppose if I'm being fair, there are very mild pacing issues. I talked about it with friends afterwards, after we had watched it. I really enjoyed it. One friend said they liked it, they would have loved it, but all the walking around, like the main killer walking around through the woods, just kind of walking through the underbrush and through the trees and all this. He said that it was boring to him. But then another friend of mine said, no. As we follow the killer walking around through the woods, it feels like this sense of like, yes, from the killer's perspective, this is my domain. These are my woods, my forest, and I have power and control over all this. And as I'm on like my quest here, these are my woods, and I will remove anything from my path that presents itself as an obstacle. So I don't know, mild pacing issues like during those like extended scenes of walking, or scenes where maybe not a whole lot happened tonally. It made sense and I was along for that ride, but I can also acknowledge that I felt it a little bit when it happened, and it seems to be people's primary complaint in the film. If I had to give a genuine complaint for the film, we get a little bit of characterization from our main killer here, but I would have liked more. I'm not saying we have to intimately get to know, Jason Voorhees over here and get his entire backstory and really sympathize. What plot we do get about him are mostly through the background characters as they try to piece together the lore, or the journey he goes on, what he interacts with, what he looks at. We get a little bit of characterization, and we have a pretty good idea about this being and his inherently violent nature. I would have liked to touch more. I'm not saying we have to empathize or even maybe sympathize with him, considering that it is technically the main character of the movie and we are following him throughout this little journey of his. I just would have liked a little bit more. But all things considered, I have very little in the way of complaints. People online seem to be very divided on this film. I think it's very good. It's what I like out of a horror slasher film that's trying to do something differently. I get why people would have complaints, and perhaps it does come down to just simply a matter of personal preference. I recommend it highly. I don't know if you can still catch it in theaters, but I feel like it's going to show up on Shudder. I was on the fence about what to give it overall for rating, but I think I figured it out as I talked more and more about it. There's less and less I think is wrong with the film, so I think it's appropriate to say, in a violent nature, I would give it a high 4 out of 5. A high 4 out of 5. I'd say it's one of the best horror films this year. It's supremely creative, brutally violent, and is definitely one that's gonna stick with me for years to come, most likely. But I sincerely hope this movie inspires people to keep bringing us good horror cinema, but also keep trying to do more with the genre and give us some creative takes and spins on it. That's all I gotta say though about In a Violent Nature. Thank you guys and gals so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next episode of whatever movie I review. And goodbye, travelers.